what happened is that the Templar order found all these. They found 6 of these arks. There was probably 100 in antiquity. I mean, just based on the fact that every temple in Egypt had one at one point in time, and which is clearly depicted on the temple walls all over Egypt. Anyhow, the Templar order gradually amassed 6 of these things, and as well as other artifacts, and they spent time bringing them up into Portugal, into Scotland, where they were able to, into France at one point in time before they were suppressed, and then they were making secret travels over to the New World of the Americas, and they had by the time the order was suppressed by 1314, completely suppressed by the Roman Church, they had already mapped all of North America by that time. And they brought these artifacts over and they formed alliances with certain indigenous native tribes here in the Americas. And they hid all this stuff. Part of the reason why Spain was so active in suppressing all these indigenous native groups here in the Americas when they started coming over is because they were looking for these artifacts. And they knew that the Templars had alliances with the indigenous natives. In fact, this is even the reason why when Columbus came over, he flew Templar crosses on his ship sails because he knew the natives would recognize them, and he was trying to trick them so he could find those treasures for Spain, and that's why Spain funded him.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so Columbus had actually figured out that there was something going on the other side of the Atlantic. He ended up pulling one of the Grand Master's daughters actually out of a convent and marrying her to try to get the maps.
Oh, really?
To get over to the New World.
Ambitious fella.
Yeah, I mean he was driven. And then he went to Portugal and said, "Fund me to go to the New World." And of course they were like, we already know there's land on the other side. We've been traveling there because Portugal was largely founded as a Templar state. And they were like, nah, no thanks. So then he went to Portugal's enemy, which was Spain. And of course, Spain was happy to fund him. So,
right.
Yeah.
So you said the Ark of the Covenants, they have acacia wood and gold.
Yeah.
And that somehow creates like a static electricity.
Yeah, it builds up static electricity, and especially when this mana, which is a monoatomic gold, is inside of it. What it does is that monoatomic gold is superconductive. And so as
monoatomic gold.
Yeah, so as it starts to build up static, then it's discharged through the top of it, where the little angels are, their wings on top of the Ark of the Covenant. It discharges electricity. And of course, to the ancient people, they saw this as magic. They saw this as the presence of God. But there's also why, even in the Bible, it says you couldn't touch the Ark of the Covenant, because if you did, you would die, because it would shock you to death, right? And the only way to discharge that electricity is you'd have to take a rod, like Aaron's rod that's described in the Old Testament or the Torah. You ground it and drop it against the ark, and it would cause all that electricity to become grounded. So then you could open it up. But if you didn't do that, it could shock you. And this is also why. if you remember, or if you, I don't know how much biblical history you know, but like in the Torah or the Old Testament, it talks about Moses built this tabernacle in the wilderness to house the Ark of the Covenant. And he built this tabernacle out of all these wool curtains, right? And all this wool tent. Well, wool is also a collector of static electricity. So what all that did is it just allowed all that static electricity that the tabernacle was building up from the desert would then go become condensed in the ark itself, which would then cause this static discharge regularly.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like this kind of history is so fascinating, but when you really look at it, the crazy thing about it is like going back to the sources, like for Noah, just for an example.
Sure.
Like Noah wasn't even written about until like 1,200 years after he died.
Correct. Yeah, sure.
So imagine that
more.
today. Imagine me and you having this conversation today.
Right.
And then it just like a cataclysm happens. And then in 1,000 years, oh, Tim and Danny had this conversation 1,000 years ago.
Right.
What are the chances that the story is going to be anywhere near accurate?
I think there's a lot of metaphor that gets the story of Noah is a good example. I mean, we know there's flood myths all over the world, and the Noah story is just one of them. Mm-hmm. But in the story of Noah, there's it's obviously the earth is people become corrupt, they say, and then a flood happens, right?
Yeah.
And which wipes out civilization, and then Noah and maybe a few other people survive it, But in that story,
and that was written. That was first written in the Septuagint?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for Genesis. Yeah, it was
Okay.
one of the early books of Genesis. So,
which is 350 something like that? Steve, can you find out when the Septuagint was?
yeah, and it was originally written. It was called the Septuagint because it was originally written in Greek.
Yes.
And then they translated it back into Hebrew, which is kind of interesting.
Oh, wow.
But
that's a lot of people don't like. A lot of people don't say that. A lot of people. Most scholars, if you will, believe that it was originally Hebrew and translated into Greek.
Right.
But I've had a lot of people on here debating this fact, and the biggest argument for it is that Greek was a much deeper, richer, complex language than Hebrew.
Right.
And Greek had like 1.2 million unique words.
Right.
Hebrew only has 7,000 unique words. So how do you take my question is, how do you take a language, if something was written in a language, right, that only has 7,000 unique words, and how are you going to translate it into something that has over 1 million, that has more complex, that uses one word to convey multiple words? Like if there's words that you can use, that you can take in Greek, right?
Right.
And it would take 3 words in Hebrew to make that one word in Greek.
Right, exactly.
Yet Greek has like 1,000 times more words.
Yeah, well, and there's, the common story is that the Greeks were concerned that Hebrew was going to become lost, and that those stories were going to become lost. So they wrote them out in Greek in order to preserve them, and then from there it got translated back into Hebrew.
It actually means, according to him, to apply a drug to your eyes.
To apply a drug to your eyes.
Yes.
I haven't heard that one.
So that they may be open.
Interesting. That's cool, though. The Lord's Prayer that everyone who goes to church knows about. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. That whole thing.
Yeah.
That originally comes from the papyrus of Ani in ancient Egypt, and it was a prayer to Amun, the god Amun. And it began, Amen, Amen, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, as above, so below. Give us this day our daily bread. It's the same thing, almost word for word. And then it ends with Amun, which, of course, is where we get the word Amen from. So Amun in ancient Egyptian means the hidden one, and it represented the hidden power. And this is why in the New Testament, when Jesus gives this prayer, first of all, the disciples go to him and they say, Jesus, how should we pray?
Yeah.
And he says, well, first of all, don't go to church and be seen praying like a hypocrite. That's what he says. They never quote that part in church, right?
Right. Yeah, they left that part out.
Right. He says, instead, find a hidden place in your home like a closet. Go in there and give this prayer. And then he gives the Lord's Prayer. So he's telling the disciples to become the hidden one, to go hide in a closet somewhere in their home and give this prayer, which literally Amun is the prayer to Amun, which literally means the hidden one. So this is just one example of many in the New Testament where early Christianity or Jesus himself was quite literally borrowing from this Egyptian tradition and was trying to preserve it. And other examples are the gold, frankincense, and myrrh that Jesus received as a baby. Those are what every pharaoh is buried with.
Gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Correct. Yeah. It's and they all had symbolic meanings to themselves. But the fact that the three wise men were probably the three stars of Orion's belt, which pointed to where the sun rose on December 25th. And those three stars of Orion's belt, Orion itself was associated with the god Osiris, and he was the one that there was the same story of him being born in a cave surrounded by animals. He was presented gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Yeah.
This was all ancient Egyptian stuff that then got grafted onto the New Testament by clearly the people who did it were trying to perpetuate that Egyptian tradition.
I had a guy in here who's been studying the Dead Sea Scroll fragments his whole life.
Yeah.
And apparently there's a huge black market for people trying to buy the fragments, and a ton of them are fake. And he actually discovered a bunch of the fakes.
I believe it. There's also been some that they haven't released them all. The ones that they found, they kind of gradually release them. And part of that's because, and every once in a while they get leaked. And as they come out, part of the reason why they don't release them is because they contradict modern theology. There's some great astrological information on some of them, for example,
Right. Another thing, and then they were mostly in Hebrew. I think if there was a very small percentage of them that were in Greek,
right,
and maybe some Aramaic. And the interesting thing about the Hebrew, going back to what we were talking about with the Septuagint being the original written in Greek,
right,
is that there was so much more Greek literature around in the Library of Alexandria. Everywhere was Greek. There's literally, we had the Dead Sea Scrolls during that time period that's in Hebrew.
Right.
There's nothing else in Hebrew.
Right.
That's it.
Right. That's it. That's right. And then the Nag Hammadi, some of those texts, they have some New Testament types of fragments, but they also have Hermetic texts, writings of Hermes that were right in there with them too, which suggests that this sect that was preserving this stuff they saw them as compatible, and that's a whole nother can of worms that no one likes to talk about, but the Hermetic texts were.
How so? Why don't people like to talk about it? I think I'm missing something here.
Because hermeticism was a pagan form of Gnosticism.
Oh, okay.
And it was centered around Hermes, the Greek god Hermes.
Yeah.
And
what was the deal with Hermes again?
well, Hermes was, he was he was deemed to be the inventor of the word. He created language. He was the messenger amongst the gods. He was he did a lot of work associated with talismans, how to bring energies from the stars down into and capture them in talismans here on planet. He was the inventor of alchemy. And he was, in some ways, the Hermetic texts could be read in almost a Neoplatonic way, suggesting that all reality. Well, one of the things that the Hermetic texts say is that all reality that we're perceiving is just mind stuff. It's the mind of the Creator. Like we're living in the mind of the Creator, and this matrix that we're in is in the mind of the Creator, and it seems solid and real to us, but just as the Creator's thoughts can change, so can matter change.
Those Greeks were bombed on drugs, dude.
Yeah, but it's right in line with what people like Maxwell Planck and Schrodinger and the other physicists of the early 20th century were saying too.
Totally.
This is all made up of mind stuff.
No, yeah, you're right about that.
So it's just the Greeks the Hermeticists were saying it thousands of years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's amazing that some of like the most mind-bending philosophical ideas came out of that period of time.
Yeah, for sure.
From the Greeks, when they were, we had the Eleusinian mysteries, all these pagan cults, these drug cults, and at the same time, you just have this explosion of intellect in antiquity.
Well, and you have to remember too, the root of all that was Egypt. I mean, all those Greek philosophers were studying in Egypt, before they started doing their stuff. I mean, Pythagoras, I think, spent something like 20 years there in Egypt. And in fact, his name, Pythagoras, probably comes from Ta-go-ras, which was was the keeper of the word of creation. And go-ras just meant, like the word goes forth. That's what it means, or the word of power goes forth. That's what his name would have meant in ancient Egyptian. And he's the one who coined the term philosophy. Literally the word philosophy comes from Pythagoras, and comes from philo, which is to love, and Sophia, which is wisdom.
Oh wow!
So, and then the Gnostics later took that same concept of Sophia as as a symbol of the human soul that falls down to this earth, gets totally immersed in matter, gets lost in it, and then has to find its way out of it and eventually marry the Christos, the universal consciousness.
Wow.
And that's what the mystery of the bride chamber really represented, some would say, in the New Testament stuff.
It's interesting how the idea of applying a drug to your eyes being the word Hrio or Christos, and then if you look at like the Bhagavad Gita and the story of where she puts the drug in her eyes.
Yeah.
And like has all these visions. It's like there's lots of parallels to that too.
For sure. Well, I think there was a lot of Eastern ideas from the Vedic texts that the India and Egypt were like two sides of the same coin. Ancient India and ancient Egypt. They were importing philosophy back and forth from each other. And we see this with in the Indian traditions, the symbols of the serpent going up the spinal column. You find that same thing in ancient Egypt. I mean, there's a reason why on King Tut's King Tutankhamun's crown, you see the serpent coming out of his third eye, right?
Yep.
Which in Aramaic, the brow is called the Nazar. And that's really where the word Nazarene probably comes from.
Interesting.
It had nothing to do with the town of Nazareth. But it had to do with that third eye, and those ideas were, or the idea that the whole chakra system of, the 7 chakra, you find that in ancient Egypt as well.
What is the chakra?
The chakra,
Yeah.
the 7 chakra that go up the spinal column.
Oh.
And there's 7 like psychic centers, and with the third eye being the 6th, and the 7th being the crown chakra. And this is really what, from a Templar perspective, this is really what what Revelations is talking about. It's the 7 seals that need to be opened. And with the opening of each seal, our old perception of the world dies off, and our new perception opens up.
Interesting.
And if you take the first 6 chakra, each chakra has a certain number of petals on it, and the first 6 chakra have a total of 144 petals. And then the crown chakra is the 1,000-petaled chakra, and it's the powerhouse for the other 6. So if you times the crown chakra to the other 144, you get 144,000, which is in Revelations. It says 144,000 are saved after the 7 seals are opened. This is what it's really alluding to, and these ideas were you find it in the Vedic tradition, but you also find it in the Egyptian, and you find it immersed within the New Testament as well. So,
what is this, Steve? These are the
that's what he was talking about.
right.
This is the chakra, and then I guess different levels, and if you add them all up, it's 144.
Whoa.
Yep. And then above, and by the way, above the crown chakra was known as the 8th sphere, which was known as the Agawad in the Gnostic tradition. And this was this was symbolically represented by the number 888, or by 8-sided structures. And if you take the name Jesus in Greek, every letter corresponds to a number. So if you replace the letter for its number equivalent in the name Jesus in Greek, it adds up to 888. So it's actually, his name itself is alluding to the Agawad, the 8th sphere above the 7 seals.
There was there's a parchment that is found, which is supposedly the original source of this sort of trial that went on with the Knights Templar.
The Chinon parchment.
Yeah, that's what it was, the Chinon parchment.
I think that's a forgery.
Some weird stuff in there, man. They were saying that like during the initiations, like the Templars, they had to denounce Jesus and then make out with each other.
Yeah, I think that was a later forgery. And the reason why I say that is because Napoleon had actually raided the Vatican archives on his campaign, his Egypt campaign. Actually, he stopped it in Italy to Rome. He raided the Vatican archives. He brought everything back to Paris. He was specifically looking for Templar documents, and he never found that document.
Why was he looking for Templar documents?
So, Napoleon was the illegitimate grandson of Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was the Scottish king in exile.
Okay.
And who was a Templar. And so he had an interest in Templarism because of that. I mean, that's not like widely known, but he was Bonnie Prince Charlie's illegitimate grandson, which is why his name Bonaparte just means basically of good blood. And he always said he was royalty, but he never presented anything to back it up. And this is also why he married a Merovingian princess, Princess Josephine. The Merovingians, of course, was the royal line of France. And there was some speculation that they were passing on an Atlantean tradition, of which Jesus and Mary Magdalene had been a part of, and their bloodline had been a part of. And that, so Napoleon wanted to be married into that. Add that to the fact that Napoleon's personal physician was Bernard Raymond Fabre Palaprat, who was the Grand Master of the Templar Order at the time.
Wow.
And he had encouraged Napoleon to go find these artifacts and to trace down this root information. So when Napoleon went to the Vatican and raided the archives, I mean, he set up a whole series of scholars specifically to look for Templar artifacts, and they never found the sheen on parchment.
So he had a whole like army of people that were going through all the archives.
Yep. Yeah, they brought him back to Saint Sulpice in France, in Paris, and in fact, one of the people who was in charge of that was
what year was this? Roughly.
Oh, I
can you find it?
I don't know.
Is this
top of my head,
like not like information that you can find on the internet?
Yeah,
When did Napoleon invade?
You should be able to find it. One of the people that he had going through those archives was actually Alfonso Constance, better known as Eliphas Levi, who was a priest in Paris, who was known for writing very esoteric things, including a book on transcendental magic. And he was later in Freemasonry. Albert Pike, who was considered really the philosophical father of the Scottish rite of Freemasonry, when he wrote his book Morals and Dogma, 80% of that book is word for word copied from Eliphas Levi, which is kind of interesting. But this was the fact that they were going through these archives. They were finding all kinds of stuff on the Templars, and they never found the Chinon parchment. And it wasn't until after Dan Brown's books came out that all of a sudden the church released this new document that they'd found that had just happened to be in their archives for the last 700 years without them noticing it.
So do you know the do you know the chain of transmission for the Atlantis story? Like if we take Plato got it from Socrates, right?
No, Plato got it from his grandfather.
Plato got it from his grandfather? I thought he got it from Socrates.
No, Solon.
Oh, okay.
He got it from Solon, his grandfather.
So Solon was Plato's grandfather?
Correct, yeah. And then he got it from the priests in Egypt.
And then Solon, so how from the time Plato wrote it down, how many years was it before Solon told it to him?
Well, I don't know, probably maybe 20 or so. I mean, it wasn't that long. But what's interesting is Plato does place the fall of Atlantis 9,000 years before him, which would have put it exactly.
That was before Athens was even there.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So he said Atlantis existed 9,000 years before, and it had collapsed 9,000 years before him.
Yeah.
So, and that would have put it in Plato's time, that would have put it exactly at the time of the younger Dryas.
I have this thing. I have it saved somewhere. Let me pull this up because this will be, I think, informative for us to look at. I screenshotted this a while back. I have the, and you can probably confirm how accurate this is. It is basically the chain of transmission of the Atlantis story.
Cool. What's interesting...
It's just hard to remember it.
What's interesting is one of the things that Plato talks about with Atlantis is he says that the colors of Atlantis were black, red, and white.
Mm-hmm.
And those were also the colors of Egypt, which is why Egypt's flag is black, red, and white.
Interesting.
And those are also the colors of the alchemical process of the transmutations. They go through the changes from black to red to white. As you're working them in the lab.
Mm-hmm.
And those are also the colors of the Templar order. That's why the Templar flag was black and white with a red cross on it. And some people have said to me, well, so from a Templar perspective, the Templar order was really founded to seek out, they understood that there were all these flood stories, right, from all these different cultures that they are encountering. They all had these flood stories.
Yeah.
And they understood that they originally were looking at it from a Noah perspective, like that there had been this civilization that had collapsed from the flood.
Right.
But when they encountered the Druze and the Sabaeans and others who were translating the works of Plato, they came to learn of the Atlantis story. And so they determined that this great civilization of antiquity was probably Atlantis, and that they were trying to find the remnants of Atlantis. They're trying to find the technologies, the philosophies, and the knowledge of Atlantis to rebuild civilization.
Oh.
And that's really what the Templars were doing. Now, some have said to me, well, that's just something that you're making up, Tim. But in fact, it's something that's been in our tradition a long time. I first learned of it through the Grand Master before me was a man by the name of Raymond Bernard. And he wrote a book called Secret Meeting in Rome. And this was about his initiation in the Templar order in, I think it was 1956. And in that, where in his description of his initiation of the Templar order, he learned about the Templar connection with Atlantis. And he writes about that in his book, Secret Meeting in Rome. So that's where I first learned of it.
And how did he learn about it?
From the Templar Grand Master who was initiating him at the time. Yeah. So
this is the chain of transmission that I'm aware of for the Atlantis story. Okay, so destruction of Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, right? And this is in the Critias.
Right, correct.
So 9,000 years before Solon is apparently when it was destructed. So from 9,000 years ago, there's an oral history of it for 1,000 years, never written down. Then it is allegedly written down by the Egyptians 8,000 years ago, or 8,000 years before Solon, right? So it's talked about for 1,000 years, only oral, finally written down 1,000 years later. This is in Timaeus.
Right.
And then, but we still don't have any writings of this, right?
But there is actually. It's at the Temple of Horus at Edfu.
Okay.
It's on the temple walls.
Okay.
For the building text there.
Okay. So then the priest reads the records,
right,
which is 1,000 years, or which is how long after? So the priest reads the records, years pass, and then he tells his memory of the records to Solon without consulting the records. Solon tells his relative Drapides. Drapides tells his son Critias the Elder. At age 90, Critias the Elder tells it to his 10-year-old grandson, Critias the Younger. Then Critias the Younger tells it to Socrates. Then 50 years later, Plato writes it down.
Right.
which is wild. So apparently, okay, so you're saying that it's written down by the Egyptians. Okay, this is saying it's written down allegedly by the Egyptians 8,000 years before Solon, right? After this destruction of Atlantis. And this is in the Edfu texts.
Yeah, so what happened was they had it written down on these parchments that they were passing down for centuries, and then at somewhere along the line decided we better get this like on a temple wall so it's preserved.
And when was that written? When were those Edfu texts written? Do we know?
I'd have to look at when the temple of Horus was built at Edfu.
Okay.
We'd have to look up when the Temple of Horus at Edfu was built.
Can we look up when the Temple of Horus at Edfu was built? And it was written in the walls?
Yeah, they inscribed it on the temple walls so that it would be preserved. And so you can still see it there to this day. Where it's what's known as the building text. And it was when they learned how to build in ancient Egypt.
Okay.
And it was from this episode of the gods
200 BC.
So that's when they incorporated it on the walls.
That says when it was built.
Right. When they incorporated it on the walls there.
So they wrote it down.
But it came from these earlier texts, and then they started incorporating.
But we don't have the text.
We don't have the text.
Right.
No, they've crumbled.
We don't. We know. Yeah. So like what the point that thing was making.
There's legends that there's a hall of records underneath the Sphinx.
Yes, I've heard that.
Where all this stuff is preserved.
Yeah.
But,
so just looking at this, it's like, I mean, how serious can we take it when you have this, 1,000 years oral history? Then it's like this game of telephone through millennia.
Sure.
And then you have Plato writing it down. He's not a very good.
Well, and I would concede that Plato, he would write things in metaphor.
Yeah.
I mean, he would take. I once was given some good advice that says you need to learn to read. Sometimes you need to read history as myth and myth as history. You have to look at it both ways.
Yeah,
because sometimes there's things that are contained in the. It's like. Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of things that are passed down in nursery rhymes or in, stories that could just get changed slightly throughout history. But if you take it back to its source, there's some real truth to it. Mm-hmm. And, as far as Atlantis goes, I think part of it was metaphor, for sure. But I think part of it was there's probably something to it.
Maybe.
I mean, the fact that he places the collapse of Atlantis 9,000 years previously
before
to him,
Solon,
which would have put it exactly at the Younger Dryas cataclysm. Exactly.
Yeah, that's true.
That's spot on.
That is true.
And that's I think we have to consider that. So,
yeah, we can. Yeah, I think so too. But like.
Now, where Atlantis was,
we got a wobbly table still.
Yeah, for sure. I don't believe Atlantis was like an island somewhere.
Mm-hmm. I think Randall believes it was in the Azores.
Yeah, Randall believes it's in the Azores. There's some Templar traditions that suggest that too. In fact, that's the whole reason why Portugal owns the Azores, right? Because Portugal was founded as a Templar state. Right, exactly. And it was Portugal was founded as a Templar state, and they acquired the Azores. And there's some tradition to say Mount Pico in the Azores was actually the top of a very large mountain where the Atlanteans worshipped. That's just one tradition, though. I mean, I think that if there was an Atlantis, it was more of a worldwide network culture.
Yeah,
more of a worldwide empire, like the British Empire. I mean, you would find if civilization collapsed right as the British Empire was at its peak, you'd find English all over the world.
Yeah.
And there would be a debate about where. where this empire base was, I mean, and I think it was a similar type of deal.
I think Atlantis, I think if it was real, it's probably still there, and that's where all these UFOs are flying around. They're all coming from Atlantis. It's like this underwater base that they're all going to. Maybe it's run by AI. I don't know. Maybe it's just like still super advanced
under the water.
Yeah,
quite possibly.
I mean, we've explored more of the moon than we have of the oceans. It's like there's a lot we don't know about the ocean. We've explored like what? I think it's like 5% of our ocean floors.
Well, the other thing you have to keep in mind, too, is, the Mayans and the Nahuatl cultures of the Americas, they have the same myth of Atlantis, but they call it Aztlan.
Oh, yeah.
So the fact that you have Aztlan of the indigenous Maya and Nahuatl cultures called it Aztlan. Plato called it Atlantis. It's pretty much the same word,
And then who took it after Plato? Was it Ignatius Donnelly? Was he the first one to take the ball and run with it after Plato?
Well, he wrote the most authoritative work on it early on, I would say. Donnelly was known for two things. He wrote on Atlantis, and he wrote on the idea that Francis Bacon wrote the Shakespeare plays. Those were the two things he focused on. So, but Donnelly definitely picked it up pretty big, and then then people have been running with it ever since.
Yeah.
And Donnelly also believed that it was in the middle of the Atlantic. Other people have suggested it may have been in Antarctica, before it iced over. Some people have even suggested it was the planet Mars, and that there were beings coming over from Mars, and that's the reason why it was described as red, black, and white, because those are the colors of Mars.
Whoa.
And that Mars is about the same size as what Plato was suggesting. I mean, that's a whole nother thing getting out there, but there's different theories on it. I will say that in Egypt there's also an island called Elephantine Island in the middle of the Nile, and it has a number of things there that shouldn't be there. I mean, first of all, it looks like a bomb went off on the island. I mean, there's huge, 700-ton structures that have just been blown to the side. There's granite, or not granite. I can't think of it, but there's stone buildings that have been blown apart into literally like pieces. And there's speculation that there's an Ark that's there to this day. I mean, there's German scientists who've been digging there for decades now, trying to get to it. But but there's other things that they found on the island, including boomerangs, which or they call them magic throwing sticks, which seem to connect some sort of connection between the Egyptians and Australia. And there's also a temple of Tutmosis III on the island, and in the temple they have depicted Mayans meeting with Egyptians.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, very clear.
How can you tell they're Mayans?
Because they have big Mayan headdresses, and they're dressed the same way the Mayans dress.
Really?
And they're trading beads with the Egyptians, and the hieroglyphs talk about the two, that they were brothers on either side of the big body of water.
Wow.
But that suggests that the Egyptians were probably trying to go find, in antiquity, people that they were connected to previously. And the fact that both have the same Atlantis myth.
They both built pyramids.
It suggests that there may be some connection there in antiquity. And the fact that the Mayans have, and not only that, but the Mayans, not only they have the same Atlantis myth, which they just call Aztlan. They say they escaped Aztlan in boats, and fled to the Yucatan where they are now. But they refer to the people of Aztlan as the Itza, which just means like water wizard. So they referred to them as water wizards.
Yeah.
But the fact that they have this whole myth, same myth as Plato talks about,
bizarre.
is bizarre. And I'll tell you, even at the if you go to Nakamul, which is the second tallest pyramid in the Mayan world, it's in the Yucatan in Mexico.
What's it called again?
Nakamul.
Nakamul?
Yeah. It's on the very top of the pyramid there are tridents. And I think that the Mayan also had this figure known as the falling god figure. But his body is in the shape of a trident. And of course the trident was the symbol of Poseidon. They create their altars the same way the Templars do, and they even put an equal armed cross on their altars, just like the Templars do. And they perform a ceremony where they symbolically kill the person and then raise them back to life. And the Templars perform the same ceremony.
Yeah.
And the Egyptians perform the same ceremony.
This dying and rising gods, this
Right.
pagan thing, this goes
Right.
back, this is echoed everywhere.
Exactly. And it was we believe it was one of the initial rites of Atlantis. And the reason why we believe that is because there is a certain hand grip that you're given when you're raised from that. And that hand grip is universal, attached with that death and raising ceremony. And the only way that could be is if they had all get it from the same place. In fact, the Hopi have a myth. They say at one point in time, all the different people of the world were together, and that the Great Spirit gave them this secret hand grip to recognize each other by, and then sent them off in different directions. And that the Hopi ended up settling where they are now in Arizona. And that they say when the first conquistadors came across the land, they went to give them the grip. And the conquistadors just dropped trinkets in their hands. And they knew there was going to be problems because one of the races of man had forgotten the grip.
Oh, Jesus.
But the Templars have passed on that grip. And
What is it? How does it work?
oh, I can't tell you that. It's secret.
It's a secret?
It's a secret.
Oh, come on.
But I'll tell you, it's practiced by cultures as diverse as the Hopi, the Maya, the Druze of Lebanon, the Sufi tradition. Some Sufi traditions pass it on. The Templars Templar-based traditions pass it on, including the Freemasons. And it's all the same.
Does Randall know this handshake?
Yeah, he does.
Does he?
Yeah,
And why do you guys keep it a secret?
because people have to prove themselves, before they're able to go through that initiation rite. And I mean, it's not something you just do on somebody. First of all, you wouldn't do that initiation rite on somebody. They could wildly misinterpret it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, you're symbolically killing the person.
With the handshake?
No,
Oh.
you symbolically kill them.
Pull this back a little bit.
Yeah, you symbolically kill them, and then if you do it right, they have an out-of-body experience. So at that point, they know that who they really are transcends the physical body. And then there's no more fear of death, which is why so many people who've gone through this have gone on to become great leaders, because they weren't afraid of speaking the truth and of doing things that could get them killed. Because worst case scenario, you die. But you still survive.
And this rite has been a part of Freemasons since the beginning.
Yeah. And
it's interesting the founding fathers are Freemasons.
Yeah, they all went through it. Yeah. And it's wild to think about. And it's a Templar rite. It's a Templar initiation rite that was being done by Templars, clear back in the 1100s. They learned of it. We still perform this initiation rite in the Great Pyramid.
You perform it in the Great Pyramid?
Yeah, to this day.
You guys like rent out the whole pyramid?
Yeah, they just give it to us for the night, and we about once or twice a year we do this initiation.
How can I go? How do I get? How can I get hazed into the Freemasons?
Well, you'd have to. I mean, you'd have to join a Masonic lodge to go through that. But there are other Templar traditions that you can go through that you don't have to become a Mason to go through it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we do this. Napoleon received this initiation in the Great Pyramid. Oh yeah, yeah. He refused to talk about what he experienced for the rest of his life. He told people he wouldn't believe me anyways.
He went through it in the Great Pyramid.
Oh yeah. I can't remember the exact date. It was 18. I want to say I don't know. I'd have to look it up. But we have the exact date in the archives of when he went through it in the Great Pyramid. But yeah, this initiation rite that's done in the Great Pyramid has been done, is echoed in different ways in different traditions all over the world, including the Mayans perform the exact same ceremony. And in fact, I remember when I first saw it, when I went down and met with Maya down in the Yucatan, and they allowed me to see their initiation rites because I gave them this grip, right, this handshake, and so they knew I knew, right? So they allowed me to participate, and when I first saw it, I thought, oh, they must have learned this from the Templars when the Templars were coming over here and trading with them. But in fact, then they took me to they had like it's kind of sad. They had recently taken apart one of their pyramids in order to use the stones to build fences for their property in the jungle, which is kind of a sad commentary. But in the processes of taking apart the pyramid, they found all these artifacts on the pyramid. And so they created like a mobile home, and they turned it into a little mini museum where they could house the artifacts. And in this, they took me to this little museum, and in it they had all these sculptures that they pulled out of the pyramid that were depicting scenes from their initiation rite. And modern archaeologists have actually been able to carbon date those statues, and they go back to about 900 of our current era, which means that's long before the Templars ever came over, right? Because the Templars weren't even founded till 1096.
Right.
So these were dated 200 years before the Templar Order was ever founded, which means they were doing these initiation rites before the Templars ever came over, which means that they were passing on a tradition that was the same tradition that the Egyptians were doing. That's where the through different lineages out of the Egyptians, ultimately coming to the Templars. That's how the Templars got it. So it means it's a universal thing that was being practiced all over the world, which means it all had to have come from a common source.
Right.
Which seems to suggest Atlantis. Yeah, it's the common source.
Wow.
Because both the Mayans and the Egyptians talk about it. That's where Plato learned of it. So
Jesus Christ, man.
yeah,
The mysteries.
yeah.
There's also, I was watching your show that you did with Matt Bell, and you apparently you have the bones of Jesus.
Yeah.
Is that for real?
Yeah, it's for real. That's one of the things that's in these vaults that we got. So we got 2 vaults now. We used to have 7 vaults. One of them used to be
You're talking about
the Templar Order.
The Templar Order. Okay.
Yeah. So when they came over, they set up a series of vaults. One of them was actually at Oak Island, but we, where the show Oak Island is, they keep digging.
Oh.
Everything, all the major stuff was moved out of there by 1765. So, I mean, they may find some coins or maybe a few things in there, but all the major stuff was moved out of that vault back in 1765. I hate to break it to them, I mean, but that's why they haven't found anything yet.
Oh, okay.
But there used to be 7 vaults. They've since been condensed into 2 vaults, and in these vaults we have the 6 Arks that we acquired, as well as several different ossuaries of bones of ostensibly of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, John the Baptist, and their children. So what appears is that Mary Magdalene, who was a wealthy woman, she kind of was a patron and became the wife of John the Baptist, and they had children. Well, then when John the Baptist was killed, Jesus was like the next in command, basically, to lead that movement. And so because he was the cousin of John the Baptist, Jesus was the cousin of John the Baptist, it was lawful for Mary Magdalene to remarry the cousin, right, in order to stay in the family. So she remarried Jesus, and then they had children, and so this was their tomb. We believe it was the Talpiot tomb of East Jerusalem that the order had originally found back in the Middle Ages, and they removed all the bones, and they placed within it 3 skulls, kind of as guardians to mark the space. They placed them in the east, the west, and the south of the tomb, and as markers or wardens of the tomb. And then they took all the bones out, and that's part of what we brought over to the New World, as well as other things that we found.
Have you ever seen any of this stuff?
Yeah, I've seen some of it.
You've seen it?
Yeah.
For real?
For real, yeah.
In the vaults?
In the vaults. Yeah. Well, I know one of them
So you've seen the Arks and you've seen the bones?
I've seen early photos of them from the last time they were opened, and I know exactly where the vaults are. And
Steven, lock the doors. So when was the last time the vaults were opened?
It would have been about 40 years ago. We're looking at opening one of them soon, actually. I think, we're planning on it. I'm working with Scott Walter, and who's, the chief forensic geologist who has the expertise and has been searching this stuff ever since he started studying the Kensington runestone. We have, but we know exactly where these vaults are, and one of them we probably won't be able to open anytime soon because of where it's located. But the other one, we're thinking about opening again soon, like within the next year or two, and then making that known to the world. So